Welcome to this presentation. I am Anna Borg Cardona. I would first of all like to thank the Malta National Library for inviting me to participate in this year's series of lectures, Striking a Chord. I will be looking at a few of the Valletta confraternities and focusing on the musicians providing sacred music for them in 17th century Malta. Information on these confraternities has so far been limited, mostly because their archives were not accessible. Now the material is fortunately more readily available to us, partly thanks to digitization of their archives by the Hill Museum and Manuscripts Library, known for short as HMML. First of all, just a word about confraternities. These were lay groups or societies that developed all over Christian Europe in medieval times, and Malta was no exception. There were several different reasons for forming these groups. They provided religious support and prayer, and each had a particular dedication to the Blessed Virgin, to the Blessed Sacrament, to the Holy Rosary, to charity, to a saint. All the confraternities that were founded were to be first approved by the church authorities, and they all had their own set of rules that members had to adhere to. Many of these confraternities also often catered for social needs. At a time when social benefits supplied by authorities or by the state did not exist. Though we must hastily add that there was the Sacra Infermeria, a medical hospital that was free for all. And this was the pride of the Hospitaller Order of St. John and was also the envy of Europe. During the 17th century, if one fell into poverty, there was little chance of emerging from it. If the father of a family died, for example, there was no breadwinner, and women were generally just unable to survive alone. This is where confraternities stepped in. They distributed bread, they provided marriage legacies for orphaned daughters, they saw to the burial of the poor, and in some cases they even lent money. Each confraternity had its own set of provisions for the well-being of society and had its own particular religious rituals. There were also confraternities that were trade guilds, seeing to the needs of members of a particular trade, such as, for example, tailors, cobblers, harness makers, silversmiths, artists, and so on. But these do not form part of today's presentation. Today I will be looking at 3 confraternities, which, not through any predetermined intention, all happen to be dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. They are all Marian confraternities. These Valletta confraternities are, firstly, the Confraternity of Our Lady of the Holy Rosary, which was founded in 1575 and is attached to the Dominican Church of Porto Salvo, or Our Lady of Safe Haven. Secondly, the Confraternity of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, established in 1622, attached to the Carmelite Church known to us as Tal Carmel. And finally, the Confraternity of Our Lady of Charity. This was established in 1610 and was attached to the Church of St. Paul Shipwrecked. Now, confraternities usually had their own chapel or altar within the main church they were attached to, and sometimes they were also fortunate enough to have their own oratory. It so happens that by the 17th century, all the 3 mentioned confraternities had their own oratory. The oratories were generally closely attached to the church, but the fact that confraternities had their own separate space meant that they were able to organize their own chosen rituals more independently, and they could organize their own music. They all took great pride in their oratories, commissioning the best artists and craftsmen to embellish them. In 1695, for example, we find the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary commissioning Mattia Preti to produce 6 paintings, costing in all 350 scudi, which was a large amount. The Confraternity, which had until then been using temporary spaces, completed its own oratory in 1697. The Confraternity of Mount Carmel was first given space by the monastery, then was moved to an area behind the altar with its own separate entrance on Old Mint Street, where it was in the 17th century, and only much later it moved to where it is now. Throughout the 17th century, the Confraternity was paying a permanent annual rent, what we call cens perpetuo, to the Carmelites for this oratory. And finally, moving on to the oratory of the Confraternity of Charity, we find a very different scenario. This was built in 1651 on land independently purchased by the Confraternity with its separate entrance on St. Paul's Street. For the design of this building, the Confraternity engaged the top engineer of the time, Francesco Bonamici. The titular painting in the oratory was that of the Wedding of Cana, which is attributed to the well-known artist Stefano Erardi. And later they commissioned 6 large paintings depicting charitable deeds from the artist Giuseppe d'Arena. These are the paintings still hanging in the oratory today. The best artists and craftsmen were commissioned to provide works for the embellishment of all these confraternities. The same was happening with musicians. Each of the confraternities, even though all dedicated to the Blessed Virgin, chose to celebrate particular occasions throughout the year. What is especially interesting and unexpected is that, just like the main churches, each of them was engaging musicians, instrumentalists and singers, and giving them a regular salary. Each of the confraternities even had its own chapel master, Maestro di Cappella, who chose all the music, possibly composed for the occasions, and directed, and was invariably paid by the confraternity. So this opens up a whole completely new perspective of the patronage of musicians and of the creation and the consumption of music on our island. Of the occasions celebrated, we find that Christmas and Lent were of major importance to all the confraternities, even though they were also being celebrated in the main church to which they were attached. Christmas. Now, in Christmas, apart from decorating and using numerous candles and lamps, the Confraternity of Charity and that of Mount Carmel also constructed what they called prospettive di Natale, especially for Christmas. These were representations of the Nativity in carton or wood and involved the services of carpenters and artists. We find mention of the crib, or presepio, being made in the Carmelite Confraternity in 1659 and in the oratory of the Confraternity of Charity, surely by 1686. This all gives us an idea of the setting within which their Christmas devotions took place. The novena, 9 days prior to Christmas, was celebrated with music. And also what they called the quarant'ore, 40 hours of exposition of the Blessed Sacrament and prayer. These all included the services of musicians. Now, Lent. As for Lent, the confraternities of the Holy Rosary, Porto Salvo, and that of Charity in San Paolo chose to dedicate special attention to the Fridays of Lent, I venerdì di Quaresima, whereas that of Mount Carmel chose the Wednesdays of Lent, Throughout the year, the confraternities of the Holy Rosary and Mount Carmel also celebrated the second Sunday of the month. Mount Carmel kept Wednesday evening devotions to the Virgin throughout the whole year, whereas that of Charity chose the Saturdays, Saturday evenings, for the singing of praises and litanies to the Blessed Virgin. And now the feast of these confraternities. All three celebrated their own feast with great pomp and with a procession, which in each case included a statue or the vara of the Blessed Virgin. These feasts must have been quite impressive, because we find that the Grand Master usually attended all of them. Indeed, several knights and Grand Masters were also members of one or other of these confraternities. Grand Master Raphael and Nicolas Cotonner, for example, were both members of the Mount Carmel confraternity. The ottava of the Feast of Our Lady of Mount Carmel was also being celebrated in the 17th century, with another procession 8 days later, in which the Grand Master sometimes also attended. The Confraternity of the Holy Rosary celebrated their feast day with devotions such as the singing of litanies and the Salve to the Blessed Virgin. These confraternities slowly became independently equipped musically and less reliant on the main church. We find that they all purchased their own organ or organetto, which at the time would have been a small portable organ, or what is known as a positive organ. An organ that could stand independently with its own pipes included within the wooden structure. This was roughly the size of a large wardrobe. The Confraternity of the Holy Rosary was first to obtain an organ in 1642, and possibly even earlier. That of Mount Carmel in 1662, and the Confraternity of Charity in 1693. The latter bought the organ of the Church of St. Paul Shipwrecked, when the church decided to upgrade to a new organ. What we find in each of the confraternities is extremely interesting. First of all, the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. This already had a maestro di cappella as early as 1641 and obtained its own organ within a few months of that date. Organists and musici were being paid regularly from 1641. In 1661, we find that the much sought-after Don Hortensio Benini became maestro di cappella for the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. Now, this Don Hortensio studied at the Jesuit Collegium in Valletta and features as a musician or maestro di cappella in all the principal churches, not only in Valletta, but also in Vittoriosa and in Mosta, and was also in Mdina. We are still to discover compositions by Benini, who was indeed a very important musician, far more than so far realized. When Benini was not available in 1669, one of the renowned Balzano brothers took over temporarily. Both Balzano brothers, Domenico and Giuseppe, are very well-known composers. In this case, it is likely to have been Domenico Balzano who took over. In 1694, Fra Giuseppe Vivier, of whom little is as yet known, took over the functions of the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. At this time, Benini is also recorded as salaried musician with St. John's Conventual Church. Here, therefore, we have a number of very important musicians, some of whom we are only just discovering. And now a look at the Confraternity of Our Lady of Mount Carmel. In this case, after the music contribution of a relatively unknown Padre Mastro Gio Pietro Grec, we once again find Don Hortensio Benini, who took over the Wednesday evening devotions as from 1661. Several different musicians and organists were engaged in this confraternity. For some reason, they never stayed long. In 1673 to 74, the Godston Don Pietro Zarp filled in as organist. He was at the time, and for over 20 years, organist at St. John's Conventual Church. In 1676, Domenico Balzano was being given a salary, and the following year, Giobatta d'Andrea, a musician of whom nothing is so far known. The year after that, Baldassare Arnaudet took over until 1682. Now, Arnaudet was a well-known bass singer, and he commanded high wages. After him, Don Francesco Risbe took over, and he stayed on for the following 11 years, possibly longer. The Risbe family was of Flemish descent, but Francesco was born in Malta. And finally, we'll see what was happening in the Confraternity of Charity. Here it was Don Hortensio Benini, who from 1652 took care of all the music for a good 45 years, until he passed away in 1697. There were only a few times that Domenico Balzano and Matteo d'Arena, who was organist at St. John's, took over for very brief periods. When Benini passed away after almost half a century of service to the Confraternity of Charity, it must have been difficult to find a replacement. His work was taken over by Giobatta d'Andrea, already mentioned, who was also working in the Confraternity of Mount Carmel, and Fra Giuseppe Vivier, who was also giving his services in the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. So, what we see here is several musicians, some well-known and others still completely unknown to us, dividing their services between the confraternities, as well as other main churches they were working in. There must have been an amount of juggling going on, especially by people like Don Hortensio Benini. He was giving his services in all these confraternities, but also was Maestro di Cappella in the Jesuits' church, filled in when needed in the Mdina Cathedral, and also was a musician in St. John's. He must have been a very sought-after and respected organist, musician, composer. All these musicians must have been extremely busy, occupying posts in the different churches. Among the excellent musicians, or musici, who were trained in the theoretical as well as the practical side of music, there were very special singers who stood out among the rest. We come across the mention of capponi, or eunuchi, or, as they are better known, castrati. It becomes evident that in the 17th century, castrati were singing in most of the churches of Valletta. We have long known about them singing in St. John's Conventual Church, though we don't have any precise documented references to all the salaried musicians there. I have found that there were several castrati singing in the Jesuits' church in the 17th century, among them Fra Gabriele, Fra Francesco, Giacinto, all described as l'unico. And now we also find them in these three confraternities, Porto Salvo, the Carmelites, and St. Paul Shipwrecked. The very particular high pitch and timbre of their voices were at the time very, very highly valued. They were considered celestial. The demand for castrati, immensely barbaric as it was, arose through the fact that women were not permitted to sing in churches. Young boys or castrated adolescents or men therefore provided the high voices. Already in 1642, we come across Capponi di Santo Giovanni, singing for the Confraternity of the Holy Rosary. This means that the capponi, or castrati, were borrowed by the confraternity from St. John's Conventual Church for this particular occasion, probably for the feast of Our Lady of the Holy Rosary in October. Castrati were generally paid very generously. In this case, they were paid 5 scudi for their performance. The other musici, during the same occasion, were paid a far lower rate. Later, in 1694, there is another record of a Signor Don Domenico, who was eunuco del Signor Ballio Carnero. In this case, the castrato belonged to the Ballio Carnero, and the payment or gift he received from the confraternity came as 4 gold buttons. And what about the Confraternity of Charity? In 1656, among the expenses of the feast of the confraternity, we find a gift for the cappone di Lanfreducci, that is, for the castrato belonging to the knight Fra Francesco Lanfreducci. Lanfreducci's cappone, though not mentioned by name, was the young Raffaello Mellini, who on this occasion was given a gift by the confraternity of 1 scudo fortari for his singing. And moving to the Confraternity of Mount Carmel, on the feast of 1693, we are told there were boni eunuchi singing in the Carmelite church during Vespers. This does not show up in the confraternities documents, since it was the Carmelites who must have hired these castrati. This is an area that still requires further study. In most of these instances, we can see that there was close association with the order's castrati. They were either castrati who were salaried with St. John's, or those belonging personally to members of the order. In the latter case, they were usually given a gift rather than a musician's payment, and would surely have performed only by permission of their owner. Payment, when it was given, was substantially higher than that of a normal musician. It is most likely that the privately owned castrati would also have been singing in local theatrical performances. In contrast, we ought to mention that the Cathedral of Mdina seems to have refrained from employing castrati in the cathedral during the 17th century. To conclude, we find that the 3 mentioned confraternities created a demand for musicians for all their sacred rituals, for their devotions and celebrations, and also created the requirement of a maestro di cappella to organize this music and possibly to compose music for these occasions. This meant that musicians had a far wider web of employment possibilities on the island than hitherto imagined. It also strongly suggests that with the Conventual Church of St. John setting trends, including that of castrati, and probably also setting high standards of music making, there must have been a strong competitive element in which all entities, particularly in Valletta, were striving for excellence. Thank you.